Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and remember, context is everything. Media Network. Founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook cover to cover, and let me tell you, we're real close to the end of this cover. 4 episodes left, that means 4 sections, which means this is the beginning of the last chapter of this entire textbook. And this is the title of the final chapter here. Latin America. 50% of my homeland. 1945 to August 2001. Chapter 1, or Chapter 37, Section 1, now. 4 episodes left, including this one. Setting the scene. Forces shaping modern Latin America. For Carolina Maria de Jesus, life in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil, was filled with hardship. Like millions of other poor people, she had moved from the country to the city to earn money to feed her family. She combed garbage for paper, cans, and other scraps to sell. In her diary, de Jesus described her daily struggle against poverty. July 16th. I went to Senor Manuel, carrying some cans to sell. He gave me 13 coins. It says coins in brackets, meaning that she probably used the local currency, but they just put coins here. He gave me 13 coins. I kept thinking that I had to buy bread, soap, and milk. The 13 coins wouldn't make it. I returned to my shack, nervous and exhausted. I thought of the worrisome life that I have led, carrying paper, washing clothes for the children, staying in the streets all day long. Carolina Maria de Jesus, child of the dark. After 1945, Latin American nations faced problems similar to those of other emerging nations. Rapid population growth, poverty, illiteracy, political instability, and authoritarian governments. In Latin America, as elsewhere, each country pursued its own course towards modernization. New heading, new chapter, a different pair of glasses. Here, let's try these. I haven't used these yet. These are new. Well, I got them while I was a car salesman, actually, because I thought, I'm just sitting here in front of a computer all day doing nothing. I should probably protect my eyes a little bit. So these are blue light glasses. That's it. A diverse region, new heading. Latin America stretched across an immense region from Mexico to Central America. The Caribbean through South America. It included 33 independent countries that ranged from tiny island nations like Grenada and Haiti to giant Brazil, which is almost as large as the United States. Conquest, immigration, and intermarriage made Latin American culture culturally diverse. After 1942, Europeans imposed their civilization to Native Americans. After 1492, Europeans imposed their civilization on Native Americans. They later brought millions of Africans to the region. These populations mingled. They created new, vital cultures. Since the late 1800s, immigrants from Europe and Asia have further contributed to the diversity. Today, people of Indian descent are still the majority of population in Mexico. Indian descent, when they say Indian descent, they're talking about Native American Indian, right? Today, the people of Indian descent are still the majority population in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Bolivia. Brazil has more people of African descent than any other Latin nation. Although Spanish is the chief language of the region, Portuguese, French, English, Creole, and hundreds of Native American languages and African dialects are still spoken. Sources of unrest, new heading. For decades after World War II, uprising and revolutions shook much of Latin America. Although they grew in part out of changes brought by modernization, they also reflected the future of reform, deep-rooted inequalities. Social structure. Since colonial days, a key feature of Latin America has been the uneven distribution of wealth. In most countries, a tiny elite controlled the land, mines, businesses, and factories. The wealthy few opposed reforms that threatened their economic power. A growing gulf between the rich and poor fueled discontent in the post-war era. Poverty was linked to social structure that also survived since colonial times. The upper classes were mostly descended from Europeans. The great majority of the population, the urban and rural poor, were mestizos, Native Americans or people of African descent. By the mid-1900s, two social classes were emerging as important forces. As cities grew, the middle class and urban working class expanded. They were less tied to particular ethnic groups than old aristocracy and peasantry. Both had their own hopes for progress and prosperity. Population and poverty. In Latin America, as elsewhere, the population explosion contributed to poverty. Between 1930 and 1985, for example, the populations of both Brazil and Mexico increased by more than 4 times. Growth rates in some countries slowed during the 1990s, but economies were still hard-pressed to keep pace with population. Overall population kept rising because a large proportion of people were young and just starting their own families. Latin America's population reached 400 million, Latin America's population reached 400 million in 1990 and exceeded 600 million in 2000. Let's see what it is today. 400 million in 2000. So let's see. Latin American population. Oh, that's not good. Okay. So, by 2000, the population exceeded 600 million. Right now, the population is 666 million, according to Worldometer, which at least is at the top of Google. That's an unfortunate number because it's the mark of the beast. And this is as of yesterday. That's the number. That's the mark of the beast there. But hey, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Sometimes numbers are just numbers, right? Okay. So it's continuing to grow, but honestly not that much. In the past 20 years, I would have expected it to be more of a growth, but I guess that's a good thing, right? To have a steady growth rather than an exponential growth of population. In rural areas where most of the people were peasant farmers, population growth puts stress on the land. A family might own a small plot for growing food, but most farmers worked for low wages on the estates of wealthy landlords who held the best land. Many had to borrow money from their landlords just to get by from harvest to harvest. Burdened by this so-called debt slavery, they were tied to the land unless they ran away to the cities. Urbanization. Pressure on the land contributed to great migrations that sent millions of peasants to cities. Today, about 70% of all Latin Americans live in cities. Some newcomers found jobs in factories, offices, and stores. Many more survived by working odd jobs such as doing laundry or mending shoes. Others scavenged at the city garbage dump. In the shanty towns that ringed Latin American cities, people lived in shacks without electricity, sewage, or other services. Yet because they were near urban centers, they were more likely to attend school or have access to health care than were the rural poor. As a result, poor city children were sometimes in a better position to move ahead than rural children. Politics, reform, repression, or revolution. New heading. Politics, reform, repression, or revolution. Most Latin American states had constitutions modeled on those of the French or the United States. On paper, they protected the rights of individuals, yet real democracy seemed difficult to achieve in nations plagued by poverty and inequality. Stop for a breath. Competing ideologies. After World War II, various groups pressed for reforms. They included liberals, socialists, students, labor leaders, peasant organizers, and Catholic priests and nuns. Although they differed over how to achieve their goals, all wanted to improve conditions for the poor. Most called for schools, hosting, health care, and land reforms. Housing and health care reforms. Conservative forces, however, resisted reforms that might undermine their power. These elite groups included the military, the traditional landed aristocracy, and the growing business middle class. They often had strong ties to foreign investors and corporations. Conflict between conservatives and reformers contributed to a political instability in many nations. Military regime. Military leaders like caudillos of the 1800s held power in many Latin American nations. They often served conservative interests. However, some supported modest social and economic reforms, in part because a growing number of officers came from the working classes. In the 1960s and 1970s, a socialist unrest increased. Military governments seized power in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and elsewhere. Claiming the need to restore order, they imposed harsh regimes. They outlawed political parties, censored the press, and closed universities. The Argentine and Chile military imprisoned and executed thousands of dissidents. Others were murdered by illegal death squads allied to the government. Why do they say illegal if they were allied to the government? Like globally illegal? Because they should say that. I just think clarity is important. I'm not saying that I'm on the side of the death squads, for God's sake. I'm just saying clarity. I'm not a great writer, but I'm working on it. And the main comment that I get about my writing is that you have to be more clear. This is a nationally published textbook for children to learn, and it's not clear about things. Why wouldn't it be clear? Just be clear. You gotta fill space anyway. Some military rulers tried to solve economic problems by sponsoring capitalism. In Chile, General Augusto Pinochet, who ruled from 1973 to 1990, promoted foreign investment and privatized industry. The Chilean economy did expand. In general, however, most military regimes were unable to solve basic problems. The threat of revolution. During the 1960s and 1970s, guerrillas and urban terrorists battled repressive governments in many Latin American countries. Rebel groups used bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations. The leaders of many of these groups supported Marxist goals. Only a socialist revolution, they said, could end inequalities. Marxism won support among peasants, urban workers, and some intellectuals. Other revolutionaries were motivated by nationalism. They condemned economic cultural domination by the United States. During the Cold War, the spread of Marxism complicated moderate reforms efforts. Conservatives tended to view any effort at reform as communist threat, and most often won support from the United States. Revival of democracy. By the mid-1980s, inflation, debt, and growing protests led repressive leaders to step aside. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and other countries held multi-party elections to replace military governments with civilian governments. In the 1990s, the only major non-elected ruler in Latin America was Cuba's Fidel Castro. One former dictator, Augusto Pinochet of Chile, was even arrested in Europe so that he might be put on trial for violation of human rights. Still, elections alone could not ensure truly democratic government. In Peru, for example, President Alberto Fujimori, what? Fujimori sounds not like a Latin American name. Alberto Fujimori suspended the nation's constitution to crush anti-government guerrillas. Since the 1980s, some elected governments have made modest progress, but world economic forces have threatened their successes. Whether stable democratic governments would survive these economic pressures remained to be seen. Now, I heard that something was going on in Peru right now, so let's see what that is. Peru news. What happened in Peru? Did anything happen in Peru? News. What do you want me to say? I guess nothing that important happened. It's not giving me anything. It's telling me about a car crash, which is tragic. That's not good, but that's definitely not the global news. Alright, well, I guess nothing that important happened because it's not on the top. Oh, Peru's recession worsens as economy falls 1.3% in July, exceeding forecasts. So they have economic decay, I guess. Whatever. I thought that there was something that was like kind of explosive. That could be bad, though. Economic development, new heading. Except during the Great Depression in the 1930s, most Latin American nations experienced economic growth between 1990 and 1900 and 1960s. Their economies, though, were influenced by global economic trends and dependence on industrial nations. Many relied on export of a single crop or commodity, so they were hard hit if harvests failed or demand declined. By the 1960s, Latin America faced growing competition from Africa and Asian nations seeking to export their crops and commodities. Industry. To reduce dependence on imported goods, many Latin American governments encouraged the development of local industry. This policy was called import substitution. The time many nations produced consumer goods such as textiles consumer goods such as textiles or refrigerators. They also set up auto manufacturing plants, although parts were mostly imported. Efforts to promote industry had mixed successes. The middle class prospered, but life did not improve for most people. Many new industries were inefficient and needed government help or foreign capital to survive. Some domestically produced goods were too expensive or too poorly made to compete with imported products. Also, industry did not expand rapidly enough to produce new jobs for a rapidly growing population. Eventually, governments returned to promoting agricultural exports. Expanding agriculture. Over the past 60 years, Large areas of the land were opened up for farming through irrigation and clearing of forests. Much of the best farmland belonged to agribusinesses, or giant commercial farms owned by multinational corporations. They used modern technology to develop the land and operate processing plants. In Central America, and Brazil, developers cleared tropical forests to provide new farmland. As you will read, this development had environmental costs. Commercial agriculture increased the need for imported food. Production of some food crops declined as the land turned over to growing crops for export. As a result, more food had to be imported at high cost. Crisis and reform. In the late 1980s, Latin American nations were buffeted by economic storms, including high oil costs, rising interest rates, and worldwide recession. As interest rates rose, nations that had borrowed to develop industry were crushed by a debt crisis. To combat the crisis, nations like Mexico and Brazil resorted to strong measures. They cut spending on social programs, raised prices on goods, stopped financing local businesses, and opened their markets to foreign companies. Most governments brought their debt payments under control. In the 1990s, free trade agreements opened Latin American economies to larger markets. Despite the buffeting of global economic changes, many Latin American nations enjoyed at least some economic growth. New heading. Final heading. Thank you. 69 subscribers. This is great. If we can hit 70 by the end of this book, that is beautiful. Thank you, God. Thank you, y'all. Thank you, you all. Thank you. Context is everything. New programming coming soon. Also a new textbook, but the textbook will just be kind of like a wing of the channel. And then a more modern look at things that are happening will be another wing of the channel. And those are the things that you can expect, as well as a little culture. So, changing social patterns, new heading. In Latin America, as elsewhere, urbanization brought social upheaval. City life weakened the extended family of rural villages and often replaced it with smaller nuclear family. Instead of raising food, family members had to earn cash. The struggle to make living caused some families to fall apart. In large cities, thousands of abandoned and runaway children roamed the streets. Many were caught up in crime and violence. To support their families, many women took jobs outside the home. Throughout the 1900s, Latin American women worked hard to increase their role in public life and to win equality, including the right to vote. By 1961, women had won the vote throughout the Americas. By the 1990s, women moved into the political arena in small but growing numbers. Both Argentina and Nicaragua had women presidents, and Benedita da Silva became the first black woman elected to Brazilian Congress. Women's status varied according to class and race. Generally, women were responsible for the home and for child care. Upper-class women had access to education and professional careers and could hire servants to care for their homes and children. Rural women of Indian or African descent faced prejudice and poverty. They lacked schooling and basic health care and often labored for low pay. A peasant woman from El Salvador, who began harvesting coffee and cotton at the age of 16, described the injustices she endured. One problem was the quota system. They give you 2.5 sacks as a quota for every day, and if you didn't manage it, they didn't pay you anything. Another complaint was unequal treatment. Men have always been paid 5 colognes? I'm going to say coins like they did earlier. Men have always been paid 5 coins more than women or children, and we all do the exact same work. Women struggled to win change. To help their families and communities, some peasant women pushed for schools and health care. In Argentina, as elsewhere, some women protested human rights abuses by brutal military governments. During the harsh Pinochet years in Chile, women in Santiago organized food kitchens to serve meals to the poor. Others protested violence against women or challenged the subordinate position of women within the family. Religion. And this is it for today. Thank you. Only 3 episodes after this one. Please subscribe if you've made it this far. Yes. Religion. The Catholic Church has remained a powerful force throughout Latin America. Traditionally, it was often tied to conservative ruling class. However, some church leaders had always spoken up for the poor. During the 1960s and 1970s, many priests, nuns, and church workers crusaded for social justice and to end poverty. Their movement became known as the Liberation Theology. These activists saw Jesus as a liberator of the poor. They urged the church to become a force for reform. Many joined the struggle against oppressive governments. Some became objects of violence themselves. In El Salvador, for example, Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated by right-wing death squad. Some evangelical Protestant groups won a growing following among the poor. Their message, which emphasized the power of faith, had especially strong appeal among women who had then brought other family members into the faith. Thank you. My name is John Michael at the Context is Everything Media Network, and I appreciate you watching. God bless. Goodbye.